begin our... Sure. I'd like to begin our next phase with our discussants that will respond to Dr. Day's wonderful speech. Two amazing professors at the Faculty of Education, University of Winnipeg, Mark Cooley and Dr. Lloyd Cornelsen, my brothers in arms. Mark Cooley has done tremendous work with youth today, examining issues of race, gender, ethnicity, power. He works a lot in our service learning, in mentoring youth, in helping our pre-service teachers examine alternative landscapes of education. And of course, his wonderful film, The Storytelling Class, really speaks to the power of narrative in terms of empowering our youth. Dr. Lloyd Cornelsen has done tremendous work on global citizenship. He's transformed social studies education, world issues. He's very much a transformative, holistic educator and a wonderful writer and a great human being. So without further ado, and with tremendous experience, both have a lot of experience in the public school system and this idea of valuing the work that our teachers are doing as, as provocateurs, as challengers, as agents of change, perhaps. So, without further ado, thank you.
I'm supposed to ask for that.
Oh, yes.
I'll come get it. There.
Here.
I'm over here now.
Okay.
Thank you, Karen. I'm Mark, this is Lloyd. I think I can say with confidence, I can guarantee we can answer one of Dr. Day's questions.
2 minutes of his talk.
Yeah, no, this one I can answer. One of the questions that was asked was, how do we bring a humility of knowing to our practice? And the answer to that is, try to be a discussant for him, because it is a humbling experience, but it's an honor as well. And I've spent the last, a long time actually now, immersed in reading and thinking about this. And I have two confessions. One is that I've stalked you, Dr. Day. I'll explain that in a second. And the other one is that in all things in life, I try to avoid judging means by their ends. I try hard not to judge things solely by what they produce, because it denies the importance of process. I make one exception, and that's when I approach theory. And my experience with stalking Dr. Day was testament to the value of looking at theory based on its ends. And so I'll explain that. I was a classroom teacher, and I had the once-in-a-lifetime experience of being granted leave to go to a conference, which was and that was wonderful in and of itself. I felt like a professional for 72 hours. And during those 72 hours, my mind was blown. I was at the American Educational Research Association meeting, and I was following Peter McLaren around and feeling this resonance with the sort of Marxist ideas that I'd explored in my undergrad, and feeling like I'd found some sort of place. Of course, it had no relevance at all to my practice as a teacher. No, I'm not attacking Peter McLaren. Please take that off the video camera. And then I went to a presentation by Dr. Day on, and I'll get the name wrong, but it was Sankofa was in the title, and it was about incorporating the use of African proverbs in practice. And of course, it was highly theorized and beautifully theorized. And as I sat and I listened to him speak, I was brought to my classroom, which is a good sign. I was brought to a story that some of you may have heard, that I'll abbreviate here for the sake of the fact that we plan to speak briefly and then have you all ask questions of Dr. Day. So I was teaching a class called Upgrading English at Gordon Bell High School. And in my Upgrading English class, I had mainly Aboriginal, almost exclusively Aboriginal students. And I enjoyed the class. It was also all boys, which was a fluke, actually, because in other cases it wasn't that way. But I really enjoyed the class because I got along with these boys, and they got along with me. And we sort of shared the space together, and we'd go play football at lunch and basketball. Actually, they would just humor me in sports. But I was kind of getting in, I was exercising with them. We'd come back, and it became sort of a comfortable space. And one of the ways it was comfortable was just in our decorum. We were really, really laid back. Like we were pretty sweaty for the most part too, and it was kind of a stinky environment. But it felt like home. And then a student came into my class named Alice, and Alice was, and she's given me permission to tell this story, is the oldest daughter of a family that came here from Rwanda. And so she arrived in the middle of the year, and she was the oldest daughter, and so she was the only one in her family who had a living, vibrant memory of what it was that caused them to leave their homeland. And she came into my class every day, and she was, as I've learned from reading Dr. Day, a rupture in my practice. A rupture in my practice because of her dress. And her dress was just a symbol of a lot of other things. And she came into my classroom dressed beautifully, just beautifully every day. One day she actually had a live flower in her blazer. And it bothered me because it was Gordon Bell. And it put me to shame, right? I had just made a comfortable space there. So I pulled her aside, and we're all doing this upgrading English course, because basically these students all, were highly literate folks, but they couldn't approach the texts that I was teaching in my other classes. We presumed, because of the language level, that's what we presumed was the reason. So I pulled her aside and I said, Alice, I love having you here and welcome to the class, but you dress really well, and I know you're new. It's just school. It's like we're not going to church. And she looked at me and she said, "Oh, it's all right." And I was like, so she knew that she was different in how she was approaching this. And she said, "It's all right, Mr. Cooley. Life is not a mountain." And I, being a good white man, I pretended I knew what she meant. And then something twigged, and I said, "Well, sorry. What do you mean?" And she said, "Mountains last forever." And in that moment, she reframed my practice, because I realized that she saw the space in a different way than I had imagined it. And she was determined enough to actually posit her reality in the face of mine and the one that I was doing there. So getting back to being at AERA and listening to Dr. Day speak about this, the theorizing he did around the use of proverbs and the Sankofa bird who looks backwards in order to move himself forward, what it did was reframe it not just as a place where I needed to include people, but it reframed it not as upgrading English, but as an oppressive room, a room that enforced difference and spoke volumes about the hierarchy of knowledge and literacy that existed within my school. And because of that, I started to think, now I was done teaching that class, sadly, but I started to think about those classrooms as places that could be seen as revolutionary English. This could be the space where a rupture is facilitated. And that's why I'm confessing that I judge theory by its ends. Because I think that Dr. Day and the theory that he's sketched out here has created an elegant, inclusive, but highly practical theory. It's one that avoids a major problem that I encountered when I tried to take this sort of like, I'm a white guy, and Marxism is my natural home, right? That's where we go. And but that didn't account for every experience of my students. And then I started to realize, particularly women, well, they didn't. So I started to approach feminism. Well, I still couldn't account for everybody. And then I tried to try on some other stuff, like anti-racism, and that started to feel a little better too. But it still didn't capture things. And then I thought, this post-colonial thing, that's how we'll do it. That kind of wraps things up. But as Dr. Days points out in one of his pieces, post-colonial, of all the posts, right? Post-colonial is maybe the most problematic because it assumes that we are post. When the conditions we look around and experience every day are not well explained by the notion that colonialism being over, as it happens every day in our classrooms. And so what I have appreciated from my immersion in this and from what you've just said is the sketching out of a space, a discursive space, that I think you call anti-colonial discursive practice. See, this is what I was going to talk about, and now here's the writing that I did while you were speaking to change that. That opens up a space between the self and the community, between the us and the them, between the local and the global, between the past and the future, and places us all into it and challenges us to stay there, to not be pulled to either side and never to ignore either of them either. It's almost like you've got two poles of magnets that want to pull you together, and by embracing this theory, I think you can find a space in between. And that, to me, is a mark of a beautiful theory. Okay. No, can I tell one more story, and then we'll move to?
No, tell many stories. You're
the
storyteller.
No, you always do that, and it's not okay. One brief point, it was in the slide. It says that the salience and the silence of the indigenous in our schools, and I didn't have an orange shirt, but my wife made us orange squares so we could at least show that we recognize the silencing that has gone on for too long. But the salience of the indigenous in classrooms is also critical. And so in my classroom, we were reading A Long Way Gone by Ishmael Bia. He describes the naming ceremony that he went before when he was a baby, when he was held up by his grandmother. After a feast when the whole community came together, and he was held up, and she said, his name is Ishmael. This is how you'll know him. Reading that in my class, multi-ethnic class, the back corner, one of the boys from Sierra Leone who felt like Wayne Gretzky. He didn't know he felt like Wayne Gretzky, but I knew he felt like Wayne Gretzky because we were reading his story in my classroom, or felt like he was meeting Wayne. Anyway. He put up his hand and he said, "That's how I got my name too." And he told us about how he'd been named. And then in the front corner of the room, another boy named Irvin, and he's given me permission to tell this story. He's an indigenous boy from Winnipeg, put up his hand. And he said, "That's how I got my name too. But I was 14. And my kukum brought my family together." And then he shared his spirit name with us, which he didn't give me permission to share. And in that moment, there was this cross-Atlantic connection. When my daughter was born, I was holding her in the recovery room, which is how we describe things, right, here in the West. We're recovering from a birth. And I was all alone because my wife was being taken care of. And it was dark, and I'm looking at my daughter by myself. The nurses left me there, and I looked down, and the first words I said to her was, "Hi, Ruth." And that's how she got her name. Think about the silence and the salience of the indigenous. The salience. What is the poverty of our, and I say our meaning people like me, of our naming ceremony? That alone in a dark corner, I say to this person who's changed my world for the better and will continue to do so, "Hi, your name's Ruth." Or inviting a community together and holding somebody up, saying, "Welcome them. consider also the silence and the criminal nature of the fact that it was grade 12 when Aruna and Irvin shared their names and the real stories with their community. How long did it take for our system to accommodate that? So I really appreciate that notion of the silence and the salience, because I think it again captures the reality, and that's the mark of a good theory.
I don't need to use this.
You can't
I'm
use
like
that.
that.
No,
No.
that's right. I already messed up.
I feel like we need to be silent. Dr. Day, you said so many profound things today, and I can probably only respond to one thing, but that'll take up the rest of the time. And I think it's really important that everyone in this room has an opportunity to ask Dr. Day some questions. So I'm not going to say what I'm prepared to say, but I want your permission to ask the first question. Is that cool? And it comes from a place of practice. I was a high school teacher for 25 years in a very cool school. And my classes were always brimming with all sorts of variety. People from different socioeconomic backgrounds, people from different geographical locations in Manitoba, from southern Manitoba to Indigenous communities in northern Manitoba. And I was a social studies teacher. And the Manitoba curriculum required that I teach Canadian history, and I teach about Confederation, and I teach about all these things and Canada's place in the world and differences between the global north and south. And that was the easy part of my job. Because I had so much variety and difference in my classroom, I saw my overarching goal as someone who could facilitate having these young people see each other through their fear and through their difference and through their suspicion and through the stereotypes I could feel being made in class. It was exhausting work. 4 years ago, I left that work. And every morning now when I wake up, I feel like I've gone to heaven. Because now I get to come to these places to hear people like this who have thought about the things that I struggled with in the classroom for the last 25 years. I didn't have the time to think about them, and now I realize there are people that are articulating my practice. And I enjoy it. I get paid to think, I get paid to read interesting stuff, and I get paid to critique other people's ideas, and other people get to critique mine. Absolutely wonderful. But I struggle with something. Because I think, and this goes to your opening question, how do communities come together to solve the big issues of the day? That community that I was a part of as a practicing teacher, I think our overall goal, and I'm speaking to it probably with other teachers here, was to cultivate students' thinking and being in a way that they could navigate the world later on. Give them a greater sense of agency, of hopefulness. I think Margaret Nussbaum talks about the vivid imagination of the difference, not to be overcome with fear with difference, but to embrace it. And be caring and be kind. The world that I'm in now produces knowledge. That's what we do, derived from data. The two worlds on paper, we're educating, and yet the communities are very different. And I've struggled with it. I really struggled deeply with it. While I like my work, I'm trying to understand and figure out how this work I did over 25 years informs what I do now. And so in the last week, a couple of weeks ago, I was asked to be the discussant here. I started reading a lot more of Dr. Day's work. And I hope you're going to forgive me. Here's my question. I pulled something that you've written 15 years ago. Sorry. And it's a passage, and I like to read it, and I'd like you to respond to it, because I think it speaks to this dilemma I find myself in now. And that is this. And this will be the first question. After this, we're going to open up to anyone else that would like to ask a question. All knowledges are contingent on particular social and political contexts. Therefore, in our teaching practices, we must always be conscious of the socio-environmental and political context of data gathering, brackets, knowledge production. In many parts of our world, people's freedoms have been taken away as they teach critically and politically. And this was written in an article on spiritual knowledge. So Dr. Day, could you enlighten us?
Could you Could you come sit with us, and then you can use this, and they'll hear you in the north. Oh, there's
It's all good now.
First of all, thanks for the reflections on the piece. And I will start with three things. I mean, we all know when we talk about knowledge and how we work with knowledge, the question of power is central, right, to that. And I think the idea to hear each other out is always very, very important. How do we create the space to hear each other out, right? So when we talk about, say, somebody working in the community and somebody working in the academy, rather than actually talk about a divide, it's how we bring it and then co-create. So I like the word about co-creation in that. I think yesterday it was Brian. I had lunch with Brian, and he was making a point that if you want to write a story, you must be able to tell it, right? Mm-hmm. And I think it's so important, right? That those of us who write, say we write something, right? It's not just the writing, but we also have to be able to tell what it is that and we can only tell if we are grounded in that community knowledge that you were speaking about. So I can see your experience about you going through some of these things and then now realizing, oh, now here's someone who is putting meaning on what I've been thinking through, right? And that I think when we write, we have to be grounded in terms of people who are actually doing the work and working through that. And that, to me, is so important in that, and our ability to deal with that. Regarding the code that you pointed to, right? Over the years, right, I've reflected on questions of those who are critical, right? There's a cost for being critical, because to be critical means you want to subvert the existing knowledge. You want to subvert the existing, because the existing knowledge has worked very well for some. It has worked very well for them. The reason why we are critical is that it has not worked for everyone, and therefore we come to that. So when we look at certain locations, right, even to have that space to articulate that critical, that counter voice, right, it's a space that we cherish, but it's also a space to recognize that others have their freedoms taken away from them because of that defense of privilege, right? And so I was writing in the context of Africa where to be critical and go against the grain, some people basically lost their jobs in the institutions that they were working, right? And that those of us who want to engage knowledge, then we must recognize that the whole ability to write, to think, and to produce knowledge is not innocent, that there are consequences of what we do when it comes to knowledge production. So it's something that we always have to bear in mind, that even having the freedom, the space to think, right, must always be measured with the consequences of what we do. And that's why people will have their freedom sometimes taken away from them, just by being very, very critical of the system, by being very critical of the school system, the academy, or the institution. And that to me, if we work with that, it comes back to the point about being very humble and to recognize that, yes, people's freedoms can be taken away from them when they're being critical. It's also akin to what Aboriginal peoples and indigenous peoples actually globally talk about, bringing responsibility to knowledge. That we are responsible for what we produce, but we must also bring responsibility. There's a reason why our elders will tell you, I'm going to give you this knowledge, but my concern is you must be responsible in the way you use that knowledge, in the way you apply that knowledge, and the way you understand that knowledge. And sometimes I think we don't take the question of being responsible when it comes to knowledge very well, and you get that sense, and that's what I'm trying to get.
Okay, good, thank you. So questions?
Floor is open to questions. And here's while you're thinking about this, here's what'll happen. You'll say the question, and then Lloyd or I will re-say the question so that the people up north can hear the question, and then Dr. Day will answer the question. But we need the question.
Dr. Day, you talk about discursive spaces. Can you paint me a picture of what that would look like in your ideal classroom?
Right. You want to say that?
You got it right there.
Dr. Day, you talk about discursive spaces. Could you paint a picture of what that would look like in your ideal classroom?
Sorry.
That's a good question. I think it's related to the notion about how we create communities, right? I think as teachers, as pedagogues, right, we create the space. And so for me, when I talk about that a space where it becomes discursive, it's a space where we validate the knowledges, we validate the experiences, we validate the histories, and we validate the different bodies that are there. It doesn't mean everything goes, but it's a space that allows for that dialogue to take place, so it becomes discursive, right? So you allow the knowledge to interact with each other and to be able to ask the tough, hard questions. We cannot have a conversations among just simply ourselves. We must create a discursive space to have the conversation which is broad enough to incorporate, to bring into the fold some of the voices that we hitherto don't hear about. The voices that have been negated, have been discounted, have been marginalized, right? And so to create that discursive space is a space which is discursive, but it's also inclusive. It allows the different knowledge to be engaged. It allows the critical questions to emerge. And I think if that is not a space, then it's not a discursive space. The reason why it's discursive is that it's anti-colonial, it is very inclusive, it allows critical questions to be asked. Asking new questions, for example, right? Asking new questions. Why would you think people will ask questions if they are simply reproducing the old stable knowledge? Because there's no need to ask it, because we know it and that. And we don't go to school simply to learn from like-minded peoples. Otherwise, we will stay home, right? So when we come into these spaces, it must be critical, it must be discussive. That allows the other knowledge to come into the fold. It allows the other knowledges to be validated, to be legitimized. But it should not be measured on the basis of the standards of the dominant, right? It should not be measured on the basis of the standards of the dominant. For far too often, sometimes in our classroom, right, when people have oppositional voices, we interrogate those oppositional voices using the dominant lens, forgetting that those oppositional voices come from, for example, they may come from an indigenous voicing, indigenous ways of knowing, and people are bringing it into that. So we cannot interrogate that using the dominant lens. We have to see that it's a different paradigm, it's a different way of looking at the world, and to create that conversations in a way that allows that also to be taken up in that context.
Yes.
I have a question for you, Dr. Day. You mentioned that teacher education needs to move from knowing to engagement.
Yeah.
And you mentioned sharing, collaboration. I've tweeted this out. Reciprocity, community.
Yeah.
Some of our institutions or educators are doing a fine job with this. And I use those terms loosely, jobs. Some are not.
Yeah.
Now, how do you see our system, let's call it that, moving forward on this so all teacher education students have that experience so that they can take the knowledge and go and apply it? In other words, translate it into their classroom practice. What needs to be done?
Yeah.
Thanks.
We'll just, Lloyd's going to try and approximate.
Can you put that in an 8-word question? I'm sorry.
How do we get our teacher ed students going from knowing to engagement across, like,
Okay.
everybody gets that?
So how can we get our future teachers or teacher candidates to engage, to move from knowing to engagement?
Yeah, the whole question about engagement is,
Yeah.
what do you do with the knowledge? So remember, one of the questions that I posed was, as educators, as students, what are we going to do with the education that we receive, right? So in teacher education, for example, when we talk about the whole issue about knowing, how do we come to know? But how do we apply that knowledge? So the application is about engagement, so that the knowledge compels action. The knowledge brings transformation, that it cannot just be something that only resides in us as students or as educators, that we use that knowledge to transform our communities, to transform our families, to transform our surroundings. And that to me is that engagement. We use it critically to talk about how do we change the way, excuse me, how do we change the way we have been doing things, right? How do we transform our environments, and how do we allow the knowledge to compel action? But it's also about allowing people to have a sense of ownership about the knowledge, right? A sense of ownership. You can only engage critically if you own it. I don't use the owning as a buy and sell, right? That I have it and no. I think the ownership, it means that there's some sort of authentication, what I spoke earlier on, authentication, that it's about an experience that I think I can comfortably say I can relate to, that I know what I'm talking about. It doesn't mean I know all the answers about it, but it's garnered from experience, it's garnered from my history, it's garnered from my identity and how it is linked with knowledge production. So in that case, there's a sense of, yes, this is not knowledge that, in many cases, it's appropriated, but it's knowledge that actually I help to cultivate it through the community of learners that I've been part of. And then how do you then use this knowledge to engage, to bring about transformation? It's in that context. So when you talk about the implication for teacher education, I think, to me, the question of allowing our students to work with knowledge in ways that are very, very transformative, whether in their homes, in their families, in their workplace, or in their communities. That's what I'm talking about it in terms of the engagement. So moving from the knowing. Because you can have, look, you can have a student or a learner who is very good. They can recite the theories, right? They know about the theories. They can recite it. But to me, how do we measure the worth of a theory? We measure the worth of a theory in two ways. One is by the philosophical grounding of the theory. And that philosophical grounding speaks to the knowing, the knowledge that we know about that theory. But most importantly, we measure the worth of a theory by the ability of that theory to offer a social and political corrective.
Yeah.
That theory must offer a social and political corrective. It's only through the engagement to transform that you talk about that corrective. And that's why it cannot just be simply, I know. It's about how do I act in a way that transforms with that body of knowledge in that context. And I think it's very, very important for us as educators, as students, and as learners to work with the two. That it's not just simply the coming to know, it's also the coming to act and to transform, that they go hand in hand. And that's what, to me, is the mark of a learner, the mark of an educator, or the mark of a scholar in that sense.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Day. We live in a Western society where we're driven by linear time. And so we're going to take 20 minutes for lunch, then we'll get back and we'll conclude with the panel.
Oh, Dr.
Yeah.
Am I supposed to say something?
Yeah.
Doc-
Yeah, let's take one. Yeah.
Okay.
Ken's coming.
Okay, I can, let me take 3 or 4 minutes before lunch. I was going to welcome everybody. Sorry to leave you hanging at the beginning, but I didn't want to take time away from George, thank you, from George and from Karen. I wouldn't have minded taking time away from Cornelson and Cooley. Since I got the floor, I have been asked by somebody to repeat something I said last time, so I will quickly, though it has nothing to do with anything, except that I'm often asked if I don't get intimidated speaking to audiences like this, and educators are the toughest. Well, no, school bus drivers are the toughest, but this is the second most difficult audience. But I'm able to answer quite honestly that I don't get intimidated at all, because I know the literature, and the literature tells me that nobody's listening. And I'm only being partly facetious. There's actually a fellow, he could never do it today because of the times we live in and the ethics reviews that you have to go through. But several decades ago, a guy by the name of Cameron at Wayne State University actually stood outside the lecture halls. He arranged it with the professors, and in the middle of the class, in the hallway, he fired off a gun. Okay, not a real gun, but a starter's pistol. It sounded like gunfire and an emergency out there. And he leapt in and told people, don't panic, this is just part of a psychological experiment. And he asked individuals, students who were willing, if they would write down what they were thinking that precise moment. their class was so rudely and noisily and surprisingly interrupted. And when he analyzed the responses, he found that only 20% of the students indicated that they were listening at that particular point in time. Another 20% said they were reminiscing about past events in their lives. And collapsing categories for the sake of time, 40% said they were worrying, daydreaming, thinking about religion, or thinking about food. And the final 20% reported that they were having erotic fantasies. So I know no matter how bad that I am, 20% of you will be smiling. But anyway, when we think back, to get back on track here, when we think back on the day, that wasn't an intentional pun, but I think we look back and remember that this event is important. Kierkegaard has said that life is lived forward but understood backwards. And we've been hearing a lot of stuff for a long time now about math and algorithms and basics, and maybe it's time to get some, equal time for literacy and the inclusive nature and the beauty of it and some of the things that have been addressed today. Now, in my very oversimplified view of this at this point in my career, I'm tending to think of literacy as reading, which is pleasure and professional development, and writing, which I see as that's a little more work, but that is the service part that we should be contributing, because most people don't know this, but Abraham Maslow, you've all been hierarchied to death, right? But before his death, Maslow was working on a higher, top element of his hierarchy, and he hadn't published it officially, but a couple of articles he alluded to it, and in a presentation he was about to make before he passed away, it was all mapped out there, a higher level of transference, which was essentially service, servant leadership and service and serving others. So I'm trying to do that, and we're doing a lot of writing. On one more personal note that I can't resist sharing, for years I've said I was going to write a novel, a mystery private investigator novel. For decades and decades I was going to do this, and I've been pressured by my family to stop talking and do it, so I'm doing it. It'll be out in February. But it's very hard to stretch yourself, and I think that's what we have to do in a lot of the literacy and in the writing, because for me, I'm now writing a book and I write a lot, but this has dialogue. What the hell do I do with dialogue? And there's no APA. I mean, blasphemy. I've got to write without that, and I'm moving into areas I know nothing about. So my daughter is helping me with the sex and torture scenes, But basically, what we're trying to do at U of W is partner with the community, partner with the field and the schools, have work with MERN and the other institutions, and have events, more events like this, dealing with topics like this. Can you push that over, Alan, and the journal too? We put out a journal, co-produced with an organization in Europe and the Middle East, but Karen's the editor and a lot of people involved. I picked up one and I looked, and there happens to be a piece from a guy called Cephade in there. But we're looking a lot of name researchers, but we have a segment in there, exemplary programs. Please, if you have programs in literacy or other areas that you want to highlight, submit, and this gets fairly significant worldwide distribution. We also started a University of Winnipeg Faculty of Education publishing. Now, people thought that was absurd because all the university presses, many of them are losing money and going under, but they lacked my foresight and vision. I planned to lose money because we're talking about service, right? Service to the community. And again, if people are interested in those, there will be a book coming out of this conference produced by MERN and probably in partnership with us. Those things will be out. We're trying to get the word out and act on the literacy message in very concrete ways. And with that, I took too long, but it's lunch.